You will dance with the eldest first, of course, Lady Marchmore was saying, her painted fan flicking toward the far end of the Harrogate ballroom, and then the second Pembroke girl, and only then, if your patience holds, the youngest. Though I cannot think why any man would trouble himself so far down the row. Edric, Duke of Penshaw, heard the whole of it without turning his head, for he had learned long ago that the surest way to catch the truth of a room was to appear to be listening to nothing at all. He let the woman's counsel fall past him like rain off a slate roof, and kept his gaze fixed instead on the three sisters gathered beneath the great chandelier, where the candlelight fell most flutteringly and where, he did not fail to notice, two of the three had arranged themselves to stand. The two who had arranged themselves were Diana and Cecily Pembroke, and half the county knew their names before it knew their characters. Diana held her chin as though it were a thing she had been complimented upon, so often she now believed the compliment a duty owed her by strangers. Cecily laughed at everything with her head thrown back, so that the light caught the length of her white throat, and three young gentlemen had already gathered to be the cause of the next laugh. Between them and a little behind, half swallowed by the shadow the chandelier could not quite reach, stood the third. She held a glass of ratafia she plainly had no intention of drinking, and she was looking not at the gentlemen nor at her sisters but the musicians in the gallery, watching the cellist's bow with the frank, unguarded attention of a person who believed herself unobserved. Edric was rarely wrong about who believed themselves unobserved. It was, he thought, the one useful thing his grief had taught him, that a man who stands always at the edge of a room, wanting nothing from it, sees a great deal that the men in the middle of the room never trouble to see. He had stood at the edge of rooms for 6 years now. 6 years since Margaret, since the winter fever that had taken her in 11 days, between the first ache and the last silence. And since he had discovered that a duke's title and a duke's fortune and a duke's famous handsome face could not purchase back 1 hour of one ordinary afternoon he had failed to know was the last. He had come out of that winter with his heart shut like a house with the shutters nailed, and the whole of society had obligingly named his coldness pride, because pride was a thing they understood and grief was not. "They call you difficult, your grace," Lady Marchmore pressed on, mistaking his silence for encouragement as such women always did. "I tell them you are merely discerning. A man of your standing must be. Now the Pembroke connection is not what one would wish." The father gambled the better part of it away before he had the courtesy to die, and the mother lives on the charity of a cousin's settlement. But the two elder girls are the acknowledged beauties of the season, and a beauty gilds a modest name well enough. "Shall I make you known to Miss Diana?" "You need not trouble yourself," Edric said. His voice was quiet, and it carried, as quiet voices do when the man who owns them has never once in his life needed to raise it to be obeyed. "I am not in want of an introduction." He was aware, he could hardly not be aware, for he had spent the better part of 18 months being aware of it, that his presence at the Harrogate ball was itself the evening's chief event. The Duke of Penshaw did not attend balls. He had refused every invitation of consequence since the spring, and the hostesses had learned to bear his absence as a wound to their vanity, and to boast of the wound as proof of their consequence. That he had come tonight, unheralded, and stood now with his back to the card room, declining to be introduced to the most sought-after young woman in 3 counties. This was worth more to Lady Marchmore than an hour's conversation, and he watched her calculate how soon she might decently detach herself from him to go and spread it. She spread it faster than decency strictly allowed. Within the quarter hour Edric felt the change in the room's weather, the particular pressure of many eyes trained upon a man while pretending to be trained upon anything else. He had felt it before. He minded it less than he had once done and more than he let anyone see. What he minded tonight was that it drove the youngest Pembroke deeper into her shadow, for as the whispers gathered and the crowd shifted subtly toward him, her sisters were carried forward on the tide of attention, and she was left, quite literally, holding their discarded fans and a shawl that had slipped from Cecily's shoulders, so that she looked less like a sister of the house than a lady's maid who had been permitted, as a treat, to wear a good gown. It was true, what the widow had said of the gown, though she had said it to wound and he observed it only to understand. The hem had been let down and the fresh line of it did not quite match the old, and the trimming at the sleeve had been picked off some other. better garment and set on again by a careful hand, and none of it would have signified in the least save that the young woman wearing it stood beside two sisters dressed in the full new plumage of the season, so that the thrift of her was not a private matter, but a thing displayed, an announcement made nightly to every eye in every ballroom of precisely where in the family's affections and the family's purse she stood. He had known poverty only from the outside, as a duke knows it, as whether he need never go out in. But he knew what it was to be made a spectacle of one's own private grief, to have a wound turned into an entertainment for strangers, and something in him recognized its cousin here, and did not care for the resemblance. A gentleman approached the sisters then, Sir Hollis Crane, a florid young baronet with a new fortune and an old need to be seen spending it, and Edric, who had nothing better to do with his attention, gave it to the small scene entire. Miss Pembroke, Sir Hollis said, and he bowed to Diana. The set is forming. Might I hope? You might, said Diana, and gave him her hand as though bestowing a knighthood. He led her out. But before he went, Edric saw the baronet's eye travel, the way a man's eye travels when he is a person of habit rather than of heart, past Diana's shoulder, past Cecily, who was already promised, and land for a bare half-second on the youngest, still holding the fans. And Edric saw the young woman meet that look with the beginning of something like hope, a small readying of her whole posture, the involuntary lift of a person who has been overlooked so many times that she can no longer quite prevent herself from imagining, each time, that this time she will not be. Then Sir Hollis's eye slid off her as smooth and thoughtless as a hand off a wet rail, and he turned back to Diana, and the youngest sister lowered her chin by a degree that no one in that room marked but the Duke of Penshaw. He found, to his own faint irritation, that he had marked it very well. That is the one they do not ask for, said a voice at his elbow, pleased with itself. He turned to find a lady of perhaps his own age, handsome in a hard, well-kept way, with diamonds at her throat that had been chosen to be counted. He knew her a little. Everyone knew her a little, and few chose to know her more. Mrs. Augusta Lovelace, widow of a nabob, mistress of a house in town, that ambitious mothers schemed to be invited to and clever people avoided. She had arranged her face into the expression of one sharing a delicious confidence. Edony, she said, giving the name a small twist, as though tasting something not quite fresh. Dunny Pembroke, the plain one. There is always a plain one, your grace. Put into the world, it seems, for no purpose but to make her sisters look the finer by standing near them. Nature is very economical. So the young woman had a name, and it was Idony. Edric turned the syllables over privately and did not repeat them. The gown is 3 seasons old and made over twice. Mrs. Lovelace continued, warming to her theme now that she believed she had an audience of consequence. You may see where the trimming was let down at the hem. There, do you see? The mother cannot afford a season for all 3, so the poor creature is dragged out to carry the shawls and be grateful. She reads, they say, a great reader. Which is what one says of a girl when there is nothing else in the world to be said. She laughed, a low, cultivated laugh that had been trained to sound like music and had learned only the shape of it. I confess I find her a little pathetic. Do not you? No, Edric said. The single word sat between them. Mrs. Lovelace's laugh caught in her throat, and she looked at him uncertainly, unable to tell whether she had been agreed with, contradicted, or dismissed. It was a thing Edric did on purpose and had done for years, the flat monosyllable that gave nothing and took the ground out from under a conversation's feet, and he had used it 1,000 times to be rid of exactly such people. He was mildly surprised to notice that this time he had meant it. He did not find the girl pathetic. He had been watching her for the better part of half an hour, and pathetic was the last word he would have reached for, because pathetic people did not stand as she stood, quite straight, quite still, holding another woman's fans without the smallest air of grievance, watching a cellist's bow with real and private pleasure, while the whole glittering machinery of the marriage market turned past her and around her and over her as though she were a piece of the furniture. There was no self-pity in her at all. He knew self-pity intimately. He had wrestled it for 6 years and defeated it perhaps twice a week, and he could recognize its absence the way a man long ill can recognize the sudden absence of pain. Well, said Mrs. Lovelace, recovering, deciding to read his coldness as agreement after all, because agreement suited her better. Between us, your grace, someone ought to have a care for the elder girls. Diana in particular. A face like that is a fortune in itself, and it would be a shame, a real shame, to see it wasted on a crane or some such when a truly great match might be made. She let the words hang, and her eyes moved to him, and Edric understood, with the wary clarity of a man who has been hunted for 18 months, that he had just been informed of the evening's true business. Mrs. Augusta Lovelace had taken up the cause of the Pembroke beauties. He did not yet know why. Women like her did nothing without a why, and the why was rarely kindness. But he knew the shape of the thing now, and he knew that the small, straight-backed girl in the made-over gown stood somewhere in the middle of it, in the way, an inconvenience to be managed. Across the room the music ended, the set broke apart, and the dancers streamed back toward the edges. Diana returned flushed and triumphant on Sir Hollis's arm, and the first thing she did, the very first, before she had so much as caught her breath, was to hold out her hand without looking, palm up, and say, "My fan, Idony." Edric watched the youngest Pembroke place the fan into her sister's open hand. She did it gently. That was the thing that undid something small and rusted in his chest. She did it gently, with no barb, no martyred sigh, no glance flung heavenward for a witness's sympathy. She simply gave her sister the fan the way one gives a child a thing it has dropped, and then she stepped back into her shadow, and Diana, without a word of thanks, turned to receive Sir Hollis's next compliment. "You see," murmured Mrs. Lovelace, satisfied. "Furniture." And then the youngest sister did the one thing Edric had not expected, the thing that turned his idol, wounded attention into something with an edge on it. She lifted her head and she looked directly at him, across the whole width of the ballroom, past the diamonds and the candle smoke and the wall of turned backs. Idony Pembroke looked at the Duke of Penshaw with a level, unhurried, faintly amused gaze. Not the arch invitation he suffered from 100 women a season, not the flutter, not the calculated dropping of the eyes, but the plain, clear look of a person who has understood that she is being discussed, has understood roughly what is being said, and finds the whole performance, the Duke and the widow and the diamonds and all, quietly and unmistakably ridiculous. She was not asking him for anything. That was what stopped his breath a moment. In 18 months of being wanted, hunted, angled for, flattered, and pursued, he had forgotten there existed a way for a woman to look at him that asked for nothing at all. She held his eye for the length of perhaps 2 heartbeats. Long enough for it to be no accident, short enough for it to be no impertinence. And then, as calm as she had begun, she looked away back up to the gallery and the cellist, and left the Duke of Penshaw standing at the edge of the Harrogate ballroom with the disagreeable sensation of having been, for the first time in 6 years, seen. "Who is she?" he said. It was not quite a question. Mrs. Lovelace, mistaking its object, began again upon Diana. "Not that one," Edric said. "The youngest." The widow's face went still with a new and careful interest. And Edric understood at once that he had made an error, that he had shown her a card he had meant to keep, and that a woman like Augusta Lovelace did not forget the sight of a duke's attention snagging, against every expectation, upon the one Pembroke girl she had marked out to be nothing. "Idony?" she said slowly, and the pleasant surface of her held quite firm, but underneath it he saw something recalculate. "Why, no one, your grace. I have just told you. No one at all." She smiled. "But if she has amused you, by all means. A duke may look at a mouse. It costs him nothing, and the mouse will dine upon the memory for a year." He did not answer her. He had already stopped attending to her. He was watching the far corner where the youngest Pembroke had been, and he found that in the moment his eye had left her it had lost her, that she had slipped somehow out of the shadow and out of the corner and was gone, and that the loss of the sight of her produced in him a sharp, absurd, wholly unwelcome dissatisfaction, as though a door had been shut in a house he had believed himself finished with. He was the Duke of Penshaw. He had buried his heart 6 years ago with as much of himself as would fit in the grave beside it, and he had built above the rest a life of order, distance, and refusal, and he had told himself for 6 years that it was enough, that it was, in fact, a kind of peace. He had come to Harrogate tonight for a single dull reason of business, a matter of a mortgage he held and a neighbour he meant to spare, and he had intended to be gone within the hour, unmoved and unremarked. back to the great silent house where nothing was ever asked of him because there was no longer anyone left to ask. Instead, he stood rooted at the edge of the light, a widow's poison cooling in his ear and 100 eyes upon his back, and he searched the moving crowd for a made-over gown and a chin that did not lift itself to be admired. Somewhere in the gallery the cellist drew his bow across the lowest string, a long dark note that Edric felt more than heard, and he thought, with the particular dread of a careful man who feels the ground beginning, very slightly, to move beneath his feet, that he ought by every rule of his own hard-won life to send for his carriage that instant and go. He did not send for his carriage. He set down his own untouched glass upon a passing tray, and he began, without in the least having decided to walk toward the far corner of the room. The music turned, and with it the whole bright churn of the room seemed to shift toward the far end where the Pembroke sisters stood, so that Edric found himself, for the second time that evening, looking at the one nobody else looked at. He had not meant to. A Duke of Penshaw did not stand at the edge of Lady Harrowgate's ballroom and study a girl in a made-over gown of dove grey, while 3 gentlemen jostled to be presented to her sisters. It was undignified, and he had spent 11 years making certain that nothing he did could be called that. Yet the girl held his eye the way a still point holds the eye in a moving crowd, and he could not for the life of him have said why. Her sisters were handsomer. That was plainly true, and plainly the room's whole opinion. Cordelia Pembroke had a laugh that carried like a struck bell, and Marianne wore her beauty the way other women wore diamonds, as a thing to be admired and envied and, above all, seen. Around them the gentlemen arranged themselves in the careful geometry of pursuit. And in the small unregarded space between the 2 celebrated sisters stood the third, holding a fan she did not open, her chin level, her eyes moving over the dancers with an attention that asked nothing of anyone. Idoine. He had heard the name only because a matron beside him had used it, and used it slightingly. The plain one, the woman had said behind her painted sticks. Pembroke keeps her about to fetch and carry for the other 2. A pity, but there it is. A house cannot afford 3 seasons. And one must be the servant. The laughter that followed had been soft and comfortable, the laughter of people quite sure of their own safety, and Edric had said nothing, because he had long ago learned that the surest way to be told everything was to appear to want nothing. But he had marked the girl, and now watching, he marked how she bore it. A gentleman approached young Fenwick, all fair curls and eagerness, and bowed, and asked whether he might have the honour of an introduction to Miss Marianne. He asked it of Idoine, using her as one uses a door, a thing to be passed through to reach the room beyond, and Edric, who had watched 100 women's faces curdle at far smaller slights, watched instead as Idoine inclined her head with perfect grace and made the introduction, gave her sister's name its full music, stepped back so that Fenwick might have his moment, and did all of it without the least tightening about the mouth, without the brittle over-brightness of a woman pretending not to be wounded. She was not pretending. That was the thing that caught him and would not let go. She had simply decided, somewhere long before this ballroom, that her worth was not a matter these people were qualified to rule upon, and having decided it, she was free. Edric knew a great deal about the postures of the wounded. He wore oneself, tailored to fit, and he could recognize the counterfeit at 40 paces. What he was not accustomed to was the genuine article of composure, and he distrusted it on principle, the way he distrusted everything that presented itself as artless. 11 years ago he had believed in an artless heart. He had believed in soft eyes and a low voice and a hand that trembled in his, and he had learned, publicly, thoroughly, in front of a room not unlike this one, that the trembling had been rehearsed and the eyes had been counting his acres the whole while. Since then he had made a study of watching women want him and had never once mistaken the wanting for anything but appetite for what he was. A dukedom, 60,000 a year, the name that opened every door in 3 counties. So he watched the grey girl, waiting for the moment she would feel his gaze and turn it to advantage and become like all the rest. She did feel it. He saw the exact instant, a small stillness, the fan lifting an inch and settling again, and he braced for the performance. The downcast lashes, the slow considering lift of the eyes meant to seem accidental, the whole practiced choreography of a woman who has learned that the Duke of Penshaw is watching and that fortunes are made in such moments. He had been the object of that choreography for a decade. He could have conducted it himself. Idoni Pembroke looked at him. She simply looked, met his eyes across the whole width of the floor, direct and unhurried, the way one honest person meets another to take their measure, and then, having taken it, looked away again, back to her sisters, entirely unbought and unbothered. It was not coldness. There was even, he thought, the ghost of something warm at the corner of her mouth, as though she had found the sight of a great duke staring at her across a ballroom mildly and privately amusing and had decided to spare them both the embarrassment of it. She did not curtsy from afar. She did not blush and cling to the moment. She let it go, because she wanted nothing from him, and a man who has spent 11 years being wanted knows the taste of that as instantly as a starving man knows bread. Edric was aware, with a faint sense of the ground moving, that he had been dismissed. It should have annoyed him. It would have annoyed almost any man of his rank, and it did something in him, but the something was not injury. It was interest, sharp and unwelcome, the first true interest he had felt in a ballroom in longer than he cared to reckon. He set down his glass on the tray of a passing footman, against every rule he had made for himself, began to move along the wall in the direction of the Pembrokes. He was intercepted, of course. One always was. Your Grace. The voice was honey poured over glass, and it belonged to Miss Augusta Lovelace, who had appeared at his elbow with the smooth inevitability of a tide. She was beautiful in the way that a well-set table is beautiful, every ornament in its place, and the whole arranged for the pleasure of a particular guest, and she had spent the season making it clear whose pleasure she intended. You look positively grim among all this gaiety. I declare I have never seen a man so besieged and so alone at once. Shall I rescue you? I was not aware I required rescue, Miss Lovelace. Every clever person requires rescue from a ball, she said, falling into step beside him with the ease of a woman who has never once been refused a step. The trick is to be rescued by the right person. She let the words settle, then followed his glance, for his eyes had strayed again, past her painted fan, to the grey girl at the far wall, and something flickered behind Augusta's smile, some quick recalculation. "Oh," she said, and laughed, low and confiding. "You have been caught by our little tableau. The Pembroke sisters, are they not charming? Marianne is thought the beauty of the season, and Cordelia sings like an angel, though I always think an angel would have better sense than to sing quite so often. And the third," Edric said. Augusta's smile did not falter, but it changed temperature, the warmth draining out of it while the shape stayed fixed. "Idoni," she said, and made the name sound like a small unfortunate thing found at the bottom of a reticule. "Yes, she goes about with them. One admires it, in a way, such devotion and no expectation of anything for herself. Her father, you understand, overreached. 3 daughters and a purse that will barely dress 2, so the plainest is put to use minding the others. She has no fortune, no accomplishments to speak of. And forgive me, one ought to be kind, no particular claim on anyone's notice. But she is very useful. Every family of pretensions should have such a daughter. It saves the cost of a companion." She said it lightly, as an amusing truth all sensible people shared, and she watched his face while she said it, waiting for the answering smile that would seal them into a comfortable conspiracy of the well-favoured against the plain. Edric did not smile. "You seem to have studied her a great deal," he said, "for a person of no particular claim on anyone's notice." The barb went in cleanly, and he saw it land a flicker at Augusta's lash, the smallest hitch, before she covered it with a laugh and a graceful turn of the subject toward the supper dance, and whether his grace intended to honour anyone with it. He answered her in the flat, courteous phrases that gave nothing away, and she took them for encouragement, because women like Augusta Lovelace always did. But his attention had already gone back down the room, drawn on a line he could not seem to cut, to where the grey girl now stood alone. Her sisters had been led out to the floor. Fenwick had his Marianne, some viscount's son had claimed Cordelia, and Idoni Pembroke had been left, as she was plainly always left, holding 2 shawls and a fan and the little unwanted post of guardian to the empty chairs. She did not look forlorn. She had drawn a step back into the shelter of a pillar and was watching the dancers with that same open, unhungry attention, and once she smiled at something, a real smile, unguarded because she believed no one was watching. and it transformed her plain face so completely that Adric felt it in his chest like a hand laid flat against him. "Excuse me," he said to Augusta Lovelace, and left her mid-sentence, which was a thing the Duke of Penshaw did not do and did. He crossed the floor. He was aware of the room, noticing a great deal of a ballroom's business is the tracking of who moves toward whom, and the Duke of Penshaw crossing an open floor toward the wall where the Pembrokes' poor relation kept the chairs was an event that turned heads and stilled fans, and set a low current of whispering running along the gilt. He did not care. He had spent 11 years caring precisely enough and no more, and he found, walking, that the old careful weight of it had loosened its grip, if only for these few steps. Idaine saw him coming when he was halfway across, and this time she did not merely glance and dismiss. This time she watched him come with a small line of puzzlement between her brows, and he understood the puzzlement perfectly, because there was no one behind her. He was not walking toward a sister. There was no celebrated beauty at her shoulder to be reached through her. There was only Annie Pembroke and 2 shawls and a pillar, and a duke advancing on all of it with the whole room craning to see the joke. He stopped before her and bowed, a real bow, not the sketch of one, and said, "You have the advantage of me, Miss Pembroke. You know who I am, and half this room has just told me who you are, and I find I do not believe a word of it." Whatever she had braced to hear, it was not that. The line between her brows deepened, then slowly cleared. "That is a strange thing to say to a stranger, Your Grace. I have had a strange evening. I have been told you are useful and devoted, and of no particular claim on anyone's notice, and I have watched you for the better part of an hour, and I have concluded that the people telling me these things do not know you at all, and have never troubled to." Colour came up in her face, not the practised blush he had been dreading all night, but a plain honest heat, half embarrassment and half, he thought, anger, and he liked her the better for the anger. "You have been watching me for an hour," she repeated. "That is a great deal of attention to spend on a person of no particular claim on it. So Miss Lovelace observed of you. It seems to be a general failing this evening." That surprised the smile out of her, quick and rueful and gone again, and she looked down at the shawls in her arms, as though only now remembering she held them. "I ought to tell you," she said, "that if you have crossed this entire room to be introduced to Marianne, she is dancing, and you would do better to wait by the refreshments, where she is sure to come, and where you will not have to hold anyone's things." She lifted the shawls a little, plainly, without bitterness, offering him the truth of her situation as one offers a fact of weather. "I am not offended. It is generally why gentlemen come. I have not the smallest interest in your sister." He said it too flatly, and it hung there between them, and he watched her decide whether to believe it. She had every reason not to. Everything in her short experience of ballrooms had taught her that a man crossing a floor was a man in search of a Pembroke worth the crossing, and that the worth was never hers. He saw her turn the sentence over, testing it for the trap, and he found that he minded very much whether she found one. "Then you are lost," she said at last gently, as though she were being kind to a man who had wandered into the wrong room. "There is nothing at this end of the ballroom, Your Grace. The dancing is that way. The card room is that way. The persons worth your notice are all, I promise you, in the other direction. And yet," said Edric, "I am here." She looked up at that, full at him, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. And the music went on somewhere behind him, and the fans went on whispering, and the whole ranked machinery of the ball ground away at its business, and none of it seemed to reach the small still space where he stood with the plainest of the Pembroke sisters, and could not, would not, look away. There was no calculation in her eyes. He kept looking for it. He had 11 years of looking for it. It was nearly the only skill he trusted in himself. And it was not there. She did not want his name. She did not want his acres. She was, if anything, trying to send him gently away for his own good, toward the beauties who would suit a duke, and the honesty of it, the sheer unbought plainness of it, undid something in his chest that he had believed set in stone. "You are laughing at me," he said, though she was not, quite. "I am wondering," Idaine said carefully, "whether you are cruel or merely bored. Gentlemen of your consequence are usually one or the other when they trouble to speak to me at all, and I confess I cannot yet tell which you are, and I should like to know before I answer you further, because I have found it saves a great deal of grief to know a thing at the start. No one had spoken to him so in a decade. They flattered him, or they feared him, or they wanted from him, and they dressed the wanting in whatever cloth the season favoured. But no woman had ever stood before the Duke of Penshaw with her sister's shawls in her arms and asked him, plainly, to declare himself honest before she would spend another word on him. He felt the question go through his careful armour as though it had found the one seam. Neither, he said, and heard how rough his own voice had gone. I give you my word, Miss Pembroke, I am neither cruel nor bored. I am, I think, for the first time in a very long while, exactly where I mean to be, and I could not tell you why, and it is troubling me a great deal. She studied him. Around them the set was ending. He could hear the music gathering toward its close, and knew that in a moment her sisters would come laughing off the floor, and the little unwatched world he had walked into would fill again with Marianne's beauty and Cordelia's belle of a laugh, and all the reasons a sensible duke had for standing at this end of the room. He knew he had perhaps a minute more of her attention before the ballroom reclaimed her and put her back in her place at the edge of things. He did not want the minute to end. That was the thought, clear and unwelcome and impossible to unthink, as he stood there holding her grey, unhurried gaze. That he had walked across the most crowded ballroom in the county to reach the one person in it who did not want him, and that now he was here, he could not imagine turning away, and that this small level-eyed girl who had just, in effect, asked a duke to prove he was not a scoundrel before she would trust him with her conversation, was the most interesting thing that had happened to him in 11 guarded, well-defended years. The music swelled to its finish. The dancers began to break apart. And Edric, Duke of Penshaw, feared and powerful and sure of nothing at this moment but the beat of his own reluctant heart, did not look toward the beauties coming off the floor. He looked at Idony Pembroke and could not stop. The orchestra had struck up a second time before Edric admitted to himself that he had not moved. He stood at the edge of the great room beneath the blaze of the chandeliers, a glass of untouched claret warming in his hand, and he watched the woman in the grey gown thread her way along the wall as though she meant to disappear into the plaster. She did not succeed. That was the trouble. He had spent a decade perfecting the art of seeing nothing at these gatherings, of letting the whole gilded parade blur into one indistinguishable murmur of ambition, and yet his eye found her again and again as surely as a compass finds its north. Lady Wexcombe's ballroom was the largest in the county, and tonight it was crammed to the cornices. Half the peerage of 3 shires had come to dance beneath her painted ceiling, and every one of them, it seemed, had come chiefly to be seen coming. The heat of so many candles and so many bodies pressed down like a warm hand. Edric loosened nothing, betrayed nothing, and let the crowd assume of him what it always assumed, that the Duke of Penshaw was cold, that the Duke of Penshaw was proud, that the Duke of Penshaw wanted nothing that could be given him. Let them believe it. It had kept them at a serviceable distance for years. "Your Grace looks positively grim," said a voice at his elbow, and he turned to find Augusta Lovelace arranging herself before him with the confidence of a woman who had never once in her life been overlooked. She was handsome in the hard, polished way of a thing kept behind glass, and she knew to the inch how the candlelight fell upon her shoulders. One would think you were being made to endure a sermon rather than a ball. "I find the two are not always so different," he said. She laughed, a bright practiced sound, and laid her gloved fingers briefly against his sleeve, a liberty he neither invited nor rebuked. Behind her hovered the little court she was never without, the Mrs. Farrow and young Crail with his wet, eager face, and 2 or 3 others whose names Edric had long since ceased to trouble himself to keep. They orbited Augusta as moths orbit a lamp, and they laughed when she laughed, a half-beat behind, as though the joke required her permission to be funny. "You must let me rescue you, then," Augusta went on. "I have made it my particular study to know who in this room is worth the knowing. I could spare you a great deal of tedium." "How generous," Edric said, and his gaze had already drifted past her shoulder, past the turning couples, to the grey gown at the wall. Augusta followed the line of his look, and something in her face sharpened, though she covered it swiftly. "Ah," she said, "you have been caught studying the Pembroke girl. I ought to have warned you. She is quite the fixture at these affairs. One grows so used to her that one forgets she is there at all. rather like the good deal of the furniture. The furniture, Edric repeated. Oh, do not mistake me, I am all kindness where the Pembrokes are concerned. Augusta's smile did not falter. The sisters are perfectly charming, Marianne especially, and Cecilia sings like an angel, everyone says so. It is only the eldest who is such a puzzle. No fortune to speak of since their father's affairs went to ruin, no accomplishments that anyone can name, and a face that, well. She tilted her head with the air of one being scrupulously fair. One would not call it plain to be unkind, one would call it plain to be truthful. The little court tittered on cue. Edric said nothing. He had learned that silence, from a man of his rank, was a more effective instrument than any reproof, and he watched Augusta try to fill it and fail, watched her decide that his stillness was assent rather than distaste. It was an error he did not correct. Not yet. He was curious now, in the cold way of a man watching a stone begin to roll toward an edge, to see how far she would let it go, far as it happened. The music ended, the couples broke and drifted, and Augusta, seizing the BB, moved out into the room with her court behind her, and with the terrible gaiety of a woman who intends to be amusing at someone's expense. Edric found himself following at a distance, telling himself he did so only because his path to the card-room lay that way, and knowing it for a lie even as he thought it. Idoine Pembroke had been standing with her two sisters near the great fireplace, and the contrast, now that he stood near enough to mark it, was cruel indeed, though not in the manner Augusta intended. The younger Pembrokes were pretty, bright-eyed girls in muslin the colour of primroses, chattering with a cluster of admirers, and Idoine stood a half-step behind them holding a fan that was not hers, and a shawl that was not hers, watching over them with the patient attention of a governess who has grown fond of her charges. She was not plain. Edric had decided that some while ago and saw no reason to revise it. She had a grave, clear face and grey eyes that missed nothing, and when she was not being looked at, which was nearly always, there was a quality of stillness about her that the whole restless room could not touch. "Miss Pembroke," Augusta cried, sweeping up to her with both hands extended. "How well you look tonight. That grey becomes you so. It is so sensible of you not to compete when your sisters are in such bloom. A lesser woman would try and only invite comparison." A little silence opened around them. The nearest couples turned, scenting sport. Edric saw the younger Pembroke sisters go still and pink, saw them look at the floor, and understood in an instant that they loved their eldest sister, and were ashamed and had not the courage to say so, and that Idoine had spent years teaching them to look at the floor rather than defend her, because it was easier for all of them if she absorbed the blows alone. "You are very kind, Miss Lovelace," Idoine said. Her voice was low and even. "Grey wears well and does not show the dust of a long carriage ride. We came a good way tonight. Of course you did. From where is it now, that little house past the mill?" Augusta's eyes glittered. "How brave of you all to keep coming out into society when it must cost you so dear." "The gowns alone. I confess I could not do it in your place. I should be too proud to be seen mending the same lace 3 seasons together." She reached out and lifted the edge of Idoine's sleeve between 2 fingers, displaying it to the room as one might display an exhibit, and there, plain to all, ran a fine seam of repair where the lace had been carefully turned and re-sewn. "But then you have never been troubled by pride, have you? It is quite your saving grace." The court laughed. Crail laughed loudest. One of the Mrs. Farrow said something behind her fan about a church mouse, and the word carried, as such words are meant to carry. Edric watched the colour come up in Idoine's throat, a slow tide she could not command, and watched her master it, watched her set her chin and keep her eyes level, and he thought with a violence that startled him that he had seen men break under lighter fire and call themselves brave for it. She let the silence run a moment, then she said, quite gently, "You are right that the lace is mended, Miss Lovelace. My mother sewed that seam. Her hands are not so quick as they were, but they are honest hands, and I would not trade one stitch of hers for a whole gown that cost some other woman her piece to pay for." She drew her sleeve, without haste, out of Augusta's fingers. "I hope you will forgive me. I find I am content." It was not loud. It was not clever in the way the room prized cleverness, all barb and no blood. It was only true, and it landed the way truth lands, in a hush. Augusta's smile hung on her face a beat too long. The court did not quite know whether to laugh, and so did not, And in that small failure Edric saw the whole architecture of the woman's power show its cracks, for her power was built entirely on the certainty that everyone would laugh when she wished it. He should have walked on. He told himself he had every intention of walking on. Instead he heard his own voice, cool and carrying, cut across the little circle. "Miss Lovelace," he said, "I have been trying this quarter hour to reach the card room, and I find you have quite blocked the way with your kindness. Might I trouble you to let a plain man pass? I have no accomplishments to name either, and I should hate to be found out standing among such brilliant company." Heads turned. The name of Penshaw ran round the circle in a whisper. Augusta rounded on him with delight, mistaking his words for gallantry to herself, and began to say something arch, and Edric did not let her finish. He had already stepped past her, and he stopped before Idony Pembroke, and he bowed. It was not a deep bow, but it was a real one offered to her and to no one else, and every soul within 20 feet saw it given. "Your servant, Miss Pembroke," he said. "I believe your father was Sir Henry Pembroke, who kept the grey mares. He sold my father a pair when I was a boy, and would take no money until the horses had proved themselves through a winter. I have not forgotten it. He was an honest man in a dishonest trade, and there are not many one can say that of." He watched her look up at him. He watched the astonishment move across her face, and beneath it something more guarded, a wariness he recognized because he wore its brother every day of his life. She was wondering what he wanted. She had learned, as he had learned, that attention from the powerful is rarely free, and she was too clever to be flattered by a beau, even before the whole of Lady Wexcombe's ballroom. "You have a long memory, your grace," she said, "for a pair of horses." "I have a long memory for debts," Edric said. "It is nearly all I am known for." Augusta had gone the colour of tallow. She recovered enough to laugh once thinly and to say, "Why, your grace, you are too droll, championing our little Miss Pembroke." You will quite turn her head, but the laugh found no echo now. Her court had felt the wind change and were already, in the small treacherous ways of such people, beginning to edge from her side toward the more interesting warmth of a duke's notice. Edric saw her see it. He almost pitied her. "Almost. I champion no one," he said without looking at Augusta. "I stated a fact of business. Miss Pembroke, the room is uncommonly close. There is an anteroom beyond the second window where Lady Wexcombe keeps her plants and her quiet. Will you take a turn as far as it? I should like to ask after your father's mares, and I cannot hear myself think in this." It was, he knew, a scandalous thing to offer, and a saving one, for it drew her out of the killing circle with a reason no one could name as rescue. Idony glanced at her sisters. The younger girls stared at her with round eyes, and Marianne gave the smallest fervent nod, as though to say, "Go, go, and be somewhere they cannot reach you." Idony set the borrowed fan into her sister's hands. "A turn as far as the window, your grace," she said. "No further. I am my sister's keeper tonight, and I do not leave my post for long." "As far as the window," he agreed, and offered his arm, and did not let his face show what it cost him not to smile when she laid 2 fingers, feather-light and deliberate, upon his sleeve, no more of her weight than courtesy required, and not one particle more. They walked. The crowd parted for the Duke of Penshaw, as crowds always did, and Edric was aware, as he had not been aware of anything in years, of the woman moving beside him, of the exact measured space she kept, of the fact that she did not lean, did not cling, did not once turn her face up to his to be admired. The anteroom, when they reached it, was cooler and dim, green with the shadows of Lady Wexcombe's ferns, and mercifully empty. The roar of the ball dropped to a muffled tide behind the door. She withdrew her fingers from his arm at once and turned to face him squarely, and there was no coquetry in it, only a direct grey regard that he felt in his chest like a hand laid flat. "You may tell me now what you want, your grace," she said. "You did not remember my father's mares to speak of horses. Men of your rank do not cross a ballroom to be kind to a woman in mended lace, not without a purpose. I have 3 sisters and a mother to protect and very little else, so I have learned to ask early, what is it you want of me?" Edric was silent a moment. In 10 years no one had spoken to him so, without the softening of flattery, without the crouch of ambition, without the greedy sidelong measuring of what a duke might be made to yield. He was so accustomed to being wanted that being questioned struck him nearly as tenderness. "I find," he said slowly, "that I do not entirely know. That is not an answer. No, he agreed. It is not. But it is the truth, which I think you value above answers, and so I offer it in the same coin you have offered me. He set his glass down upon the sill, the claret still untouched, and he looked at her fully. I crossed the room because I have watched a great many people be cruel in a great many drawing rooms, and I have watched a great many others endure it by growing hard, or growing false, or learning to be cruel in their turn. I have never once, until tonight, watched anyone endure it by simply refusing to become smaller. You would not shrink. It disarranged me. I wished to know how it was done. Something flickered in her face, the barest easing, though her guard did not fall. It is not done by any art, she said. It is done because I have 4 people who need me not to weep in front of strangers, and so I do not. There is nothing admirable in necessity, your grace. You mistake endurance for strength. They are cousins, not the same. Are they? He said, and found he was leaning toward her, and made himself be still. I have lived a long while on endurance, Miss Pembroke. I should be glad to learn where it ends and the other begins. For a moment neither spoke. The ferns stirred faintly in the draught from the window, and beyond the door the music rose and fell, and Edric was conscious that he ought to return her to her post, that every additional minute was a minute the room would count and use against her, and that he did not, God help him, want to open the door. He wanted to stand in this green dimness and keep asking her questions, and keep receiving these plain, unsparing, extraordinary answers until he understood how a woman with nothing came to possess the one thing he had never been able to buy with all that he had, which was the freedom to be exactly and only herself. You are still looking at me as though I am a sum you cannot make come right, Idunny said. There was at last the faint ghost of something warmer in her voice, almost amusement. It is unnerving. I am accustomed to not being looked at. I am aware, Edric said quietly. That is the part I cannot make come right. She had no ready answer to that. He saw her search for one, the practiced deflection, the modest disclaimer, and he saw her decline to use it, saw her choose instead to simply hold his gaze, and the holding of it lasted a breath longer than either of them had meant, and undid something in him he had thought long past undoing. Then she stepped back, gently, and reached for the door. My post, your grace, she said. As far as the window, we agreed, and no further. As far as the window, he said, and let her open it, and walked her back into the light and the noise with his face composed to its usual cold indifference, so that no one watching would guess that the Duke of Penshaw, who wanted nothing that could be given him, had just discovered how badly he wanted only to keep talking to a woman he could not stop looking at. The music had swelled again behind them, some bright country air that summoned the young and the hopeful back onto the floor, and Edric found that he did not wish to return to it. He had spent a lifetime being wished for across crowded rooms, and the wishing had long since ceased to warm him. Yet here, in the shadow of a marble column where the candlelight thinned to gold, he could not make his feet carry him away from the woman who had just told him, without art or apology, that she had never once expected a duke to remember her name. I remember it now, he said, and heard the low roughness of his own voice, as though it belonged to another man. Idunny, I shall not forget it again. She looked up at him then, and there was no triumph in her face, no calculation, none of the sudden softening he had watched 100 women summon when they realized the tide had turned in their favor. There was only a kind of wariness, gentle and clear-eyed, as if she were trying to understand what game he meant to play and had already resolved not to lose herself in it. You needn't remember it, your grace, she said. There is no advantage to you in remembering me. My sisters are the ones the room is watching. If you have come to be introduced to Beatrice or to Marianne, I will gladly bring you to them. Marianne dances beautifully. Everyone says so. Everyone is a poor judge, Edric said. Everyone has been asking me all evening about your sisters. I have not asked once. A faint colour rose in her cheeks, and she turned her face a little toward the terrace doors, where the July night pressed cool and blue against the glass. Then perhaps you are only being contrary. Great men often are, when they have grown tired of being agreed with. He should have taken offence. He was accustomed to deference so complete it had become a species of loneliness, and any other creature in that ballroom who dared name him contrary would have found the full winter of his displeasure. Instead, something in his chest loosened, unfamiliar and almost painful, and he heard himself laugh quietly, a sound he scarcely recognized. "Come," he said, before prudence could stop him. "The air in here is intolerable, and I have been intolerable in it long enough. Walk with me. There is a gallery beyond the doors that looks over the garden. We shall be perfectly visible to a dozen scandalized matrons, so your reputation may consider itself under guard." She hesitated, and he understood the hesitation for what it was. A woman in her position could not afford to be seen leaving a ballroom on the arm of a duke and then set down again unwanted when his curiosity had run its course. She had counted that cost already. He could see her counting it. It shamed him, somehow, that she was wiser about the world's cruelty than he had allowed himself to be in years. "I give you my word," he said, more gently, "that no unkindness will come to you from my hand. I have been the cause of enough talk in my life to know its price. I would not make you pay it." Whatever she saw in his face seemed to decide her. She laid her gloved fingers upon his offered arm, so lightly that he felt the weight of them more in his mind than on his sleeve, and they passed together through the tall doors into the long stone gallery beyond. The night received them kindly. Torches burned in iron brackets down the length of the terrace, and past the balustrade the garden fell away in dark hedges and pale gravel walks, a fountain somewhere murmuring to itself in the dark. The noise of the ball dropped to a muffled brightness at their backs. Edric drew a breath of the cooling air and felt the tightness he carried always between his shoulders begin, absurdly, to ease. "There," he said. "That is better. A man cannot think inside that furnace. He can only be looked at." Is it so wearisome to be looked at? There was no mockery in the question. She had stopped at the balustrade and set her hands upon the cool stone, and she was gazing out at the garden rather than at him, which he found he liked, for it let him look at her without being caught at it. The torchlight moved along the line of her throat and touched the plain silver comb in her hair, which was the only ornament she wore, and which someone crueler than he had already remarked upon that evening within her hearing. "You would think it a great prize," he said. "Everyone does. To be wanted by rooms full of people who have never spoken a true word to you." He set his own hands upon the balustrade a careful distance from hers. "I was wanted very much, once by a woman who wanted the title I would carry and the houses I would own, and the name she might sign at the foot of her letters. She was very beautiful and very clever, and I was young enough to believe that when she looked at me she saw a man. She saw a coronet. I learned the difference on the morning she married my cousin, who stood to inherit a marquisate outright and did not require her to wait upon an old duke's slow dying to become great. She was quite honest about it, in the end. She said I had never been the object. I'd only been the likeliest road. He had not meant to say any of it. He had told that story to no one in a decade, had buried it so deep that even his oldest friends knew only that the Duke of Penshaw did not court and would not be courted, that his reserve was a fortress with the drawbridge long spur. Yet it had come out of him here, in the torchlight, to a woman he had known for the length of a single evening, and he could not for his life have said why, except that she had asked him a plain question and looked as though she truly wished to know the answer. Idoine was silent a moment. When she spoke, she did not offer him the pity he had braced himself against, the murmured "how dreadful," the practiced sympathy that would have let him despise her and end the thing cleanly. "So that is why," she said slowly, "you look at every room as though it means to rob you." He turned his head sharply. "Does it show so plainly?" "To me it does." A small, rueful smile touched her mouth. "I have spent a great many evenings standing against a great many walls, Your Grace, watching people want things from one another. One learns to read the wanting. Most of it is hunger dressed in silk. Yours is only a man guarding a door." She looked at him fully then, and her eyes in the torchlight were steady and kind and entirely without fear of him. "I am sorry she taught you that lesson. It was a lie, you know. Not everyone comes to the door to rob the house." Something turned over in his chest, slow and heavy, like a stone rolled back from the mouth of a place long sealed. He did not answer at once. He was afraid of what his voice would do. "And you," he managed finally. "You read the whole room, and I know nothing of you at all, save that you bear insult better than any general I have commanded, and that your sisters dance beautifully." Everyone says so. He let the echo of her own words sit between them, and was rewarded by the flash of a real smile, quick and bright and gone. "Tell me something true, Idoni Pembroke, not the version you give to men who mean to be introduced to Marianne." She looked back out over the garden, and for a moment he thought she would deflect it, turn it aside with some graceful nothing as she surely had 1,000 times. But she seemed to weigh him and to decide, as she had decided at the door, that he had earned a plain answer. "My father was a gentleman with more name than fortune," she said. "When he died there was very little, and what there was must go to see my sisters well married, for that is the whole of our estate now. 3 faces the world admires, and one it does not trouble to. I keep the household accounts. I turn the gowns so the wear does not show. I sit up mending trim by candle end so that Beatrice and Marianne may go into the light looking as though we were never poor at all." She said it without a tremor, without once reaching for his sympathy, as a woman might name the weather. "It is not a tragedy, your grace. A great many women live smaller lives and complain of them less. I am fed and I am housed and I am loved by my sisters, who are not cruel, whatever the world's Augustas make of them. I only ask the evenings to end quickly, as a rule. This one I find I do not mind so much." The torch above them guttered in a stray current of air, and in the shift of the light he saw, for the space of a heartbeat, exactly what had cost her to say the last of it, the small, brave hope she had let slip into the open, and the immediate readiness to be laughed at for it. He thought of the silver comb, the only ornament she owned, and understood suddenly that she had given the finer things to her sisters and kept the plain one for herself, and had done it gladly, and would do it again. "Idoni," he said. She had turned back to the garden. He reached out without deciding to and drew off his glove, and then hesitated with his bare hand a breath away from where hers rested upon the stone. He did not touch her. He was a man who had not asked for anything in 10 years, who had made an art of wanting nothing so that nothing might be taken from him, and now he stood with his hand suspended over a poor girl's mended glove and found that he wanted, with an H that frightened him, only to be permitted to close the distance. She had gone very still. She did not draw her hand away. The small space between his fingers and hers seemed to Edric to hold the whole weight of the night, the muffled music, the murmuring fountain, the 12 scandalized matrons he had promised her, all of it hanging upon whether she would let a duke set his bare hand over her glove in the dark. Then, so slightly that a less desperate man might have missed it, she turned her hand upon the stone, palm upward, and let her fingers open. He set his hand to hers. Even through the worn kid of her glove he felt the warmth of her, the fine tremor she could not quite still, and his own heart struck once hard, like a fist against a door. Neither of them spoke. She was looking at their joined hands as though she could not account for them. He was looking at her face, at the torchlight moving in her lashes, and thinking, with that clarity that undid him utterly, that in all the crowded rooms of all the wasted years he had never once been looked at as this woman was not looking at him. Never once been in the presence of someone who plainly did not care in the least that his hand was a duke's hand, but only that it was warm and offered, and hers. "You should not do this," she said softly, and did not let go. "Tomorrow you will be the Duke of Penshaw again, and I will be the Pembroke girl no one asks to dance, and there will be a great many people to remind us both of the difference. Do not be kind to me tonight, your grace, if you mean to have forgotten me by the time the carriages are called. I can bear the wall. I have grown very good at the wall. I do not think I could bear having stood in the light and been sent back to it. I have no intention of sending you anywhere," he said, and heard the vow in it before he had meant to make one. "And I have never been less inclined to remember that I am a duke." For a long moment she searched his face, and he let her, holding still under that clear and careful gaze as he had held still under nothing else in years, willing her to see that for once the wanting in a great room was not hunger dressed in silk. Whatever she found there brought a brightness to her eyes that she blinked quickly away, and her fingers tightened once upon his, fierce and brief, before the world came back. It came back in the form of a voice, bright, carrying, and threaded through with the particular sweetness that Edric had learned that very evening to distrust. "Idoni? Idoni, are you out here? Half the room is asking where the Duke of Penshaw has vanished to, and here you are keeping him all to yourself. How very enterprising of you, dearest. Augusta Lovelace stood framed in the terrace doors with the ballroom blazing at her back, and though her words were honeyed, Edric did not miss the swift, hard flick of her eyes to their two hands upon the balustrade, nor the way something calculating settled behind her smile as she marked exactly what she had found and began, plainly, to reckon what might be made of it. Idony drew her hand from his gently and without haste, and the loss of it went through him like cold water. "I was showing his grace the garden, Augusta," Idony said evenly. "He found the ballroom close." "I am sure he did." Augusta came forward into the torchlight, and her gaze passed over Idony's turned gown with a slow, deliberate thoroughness that was itself a kind of blow, before she turned the full warmth of herself upon Edric with the ease of long practice. "Your Grace, you must let me restore you to civilized company. My aunt has been longing this age to present you to the Pembroke sisters, the true ornaments of the family, you understand. Beatrice sings, and Marianne. Well, everyone says Marianne is the loveliest creature in 3 counties. It would be cruel to deny them, when you have been so generously patient with poor Idony's little tour." The insult was so smoothly done that a man might have swallowed it whole, and thanked her for the sugar. Edric felt the altar rise in him, the cold he kept for precisely such moments, and he saw Idony brace for it, saw her school her face to bear the dismissal she had spent her life expecting, saw her begin, already, to step back toward the wall where the world insisted she belonged. He did not let her reach it. He inclined his head to Augusta with a courtesy so exact and so cold that the young woman's smile faltered at its edges. "You are mistaken, madam, in supposing me patient," he said. "I have been patient. I have been more content this quarter hour than I have been in a year of ballrooms, and I am not aware that Miss Idony Pembroke has cost me a single moment I would call poor." He turned from Augusta as though she had already left, and offered Idony his arm, deliberately. In full view of the doors and the 12 matrons and the whole blazing room beyond. "Miss Pembroke, the night is early yet, and you have not finished showing me the garden. I find I am in no hurry to be restored to anyone." He felt, rather than saw, the tremor that passed through Idony's fingers as she took his arm, felt the disbelief in it, and beneath the disbelief a warmth that answered his own. But he saw, too, over the crown of her plain silver comb, the look that crossed Augusta Lovelace's face as she stood dismissed in the torchlight with the whole of her charm spent for nothing, the swift, ugly narrowing of a woman unused to being passed over, calculating already what such a slight would cost her before all her friends, and what she would require in return. It was gone in an instant, folded back beneath the honey. But Edric had spent a lifetime reading rooms, and he knew the look of a door being marked for burning. He drew Idony closer against his side and walked her out along the dark gravel, away from the light, and told himself the chill he felt had nothing to do with the summer night. Whatever was coming, it would come for her, because of him. He had made her visible, and he already knew, with the certainty of a man who had been robbed once and learned the world's cruelty by heart, that the visible were the first the cruel came to break. For 3 days Edric carried the memory of the garden about with him like a coal held in a bare palm, and could not decide whether it warmed him or burned. He had let her see too much. He knew it the moment he woke, in the grey before his valet came, with the shape of her voice still in the room. Idony Pembroke had said nothing to flatter him, everything to undo him, and a man who had spent 12 years teaching his heart to keep its own counsel does not forgive himself easily for a lowered guard. Yet when he rose and stood at the tall window of Penshaw House, watching the mist lift off the square, he found he was not sorry. That frightened him more than the wanting did. He had told himself when he came up to town for the season that he would attend what he must, dance with whom civility demanded, and leave before the candles guttered. He had told himself this every season for a decade, ever since Cassandra. He did not permit himself her name often. He permitted himself the lesson of her, which was cleaner and did not ache so. The lesson was this, that a beautiful woman may look at a man and see only the acreage behind him, the rent rolls and the strawberry leaves, and speak of love in a voice so warm and so practiced that he will believe against all evidence, and stand up before a church and a county to say so, and be left there. He had been left there. The whole of society had watched him be left there, and had been kind to his face and merciless behind their fans. and he had learned that kindness and cruelty in a ballroom wear the same silk. So he had built the wall, and the wall had served him, and now a girl in a made-over gown of 2 seasons past had walked through it as though it were a garden gate left on the latch, and he did not know how she had done it, only that she had not tried. That was the whole of it. She had not tried. He was still at the window when Mercer brought the card. Lady Augusta Lovelace requested the honour of His Grace's attendance that evening at the Harmsworth rout. The Marchioness would be receiving. There would be cards and dancing and a late supper. Adric turned the card in his fingers. He had no love for Augusta Lovelace and less for the tribe of her admirers, but he knew the Pembroke sisters would be there, for the Lovelace and Pembroke households ran in the same current, and where the celebrated sisters went, their plainer cousin was sent to carry shawls and hold places and be grateful. Idoni would be there. He set the card against the clock on the mantel and told Mercer to have the greys put to at 9. He ought to have suspected something from the warmth of his welcome. Augusta met him at the head of the Harmsworth stairs with both hands and a smile that showed all her teeth, and drew him into the crush as a fisherman draws in a line, and Edric let himself be drawn, because from the top of the stairs he had already found the one still point in the room. Idoni stood a little apart near the musicians in grey again, holding her eldest sister's fan and her middle sister's reticule, listening to a dowager who was not listening to her. She had not seen him yet. He watched the way she bore the dowager's monologue with a courtesy that asked nothing back, and something in his chest turned over, slow and irrevocable, and he thought, with a calm that surprised him, that he had better speak to her father before the week was out. He never reached her. Augusta had a hand on his sleeve and a story in her mouth, and around them the room seemed to gather and hush by degrees, the way a field goes still before weather. He became aware of it too late, the tilt of heads, the fans lifting, the particular quality of a silence that has been arranged. Augusta raised her clear carrying voice as though continuing a conversation everyone had already begun. But your Grace has not heard. I confess I am astonished. Why, it is the talk of 3 drawing rooms. She pressed a hand to her breast in a mummery of reluctance. One does so hate to be the bearer, but you, of all men, ought to know before you are made, forgive me, before you are made ridiculous. I find I am rarely made ridiculous by things I have not heard, Adric said. His voice came out level. Long practice. If you have something to say, Lady Augusta, say it plainly and let us be done. Only that a certain young person has been very clever. Augusta's eyes flicked, just once, toward the grey figure by the musicians, and every eye in the room followed the flick like iron filings turning to a lodged stone. It seems Miss Irony Pembroke has been heard, by more than one lady of unimpeachable ear, to boast of how neatly she has caught the Duke of Penshaw, to boast, your Grace, of the letters, of little walk in the Harmsworth's garden 3 nights past. Oh, we all know of it, there are no secrets in a hedge. Of how a girl with no fortune and no face to speak of might yet be a duchess if only she plays the meek thing prettily enough, and lets the great man believe he was never played at all. She let the words settle like ash. There are those who have seen the letters she keeps. Your hand, they say. Kept and counted like coin. She means to have you, sir. She has said as much. I would not be a friend to you if I let you walk into it blind. For the length of one breath the ballroom did not exist. Edric heard only the blood in his own ears, and under it, rising, a voice 12 years silenced. Cassandra's voice, warm and practiced, saying love in the tone one uses for a purchase. The old wound did not ache, it roared. Every instinct he had spent a decade tempering flung itself up at once, and told him the same thing it had told him then, in the language of a man who has been made a fool before a county. They always want the leaves and the acres, they smile, and they want the acres. You knew this. You knew this. You let the gate stand open, and you knew. He did not answer at once, he could not, and he felt the room read his silence and grow bright with it, greedy, the fans working now, the heads bending together, and he understood with a sick lurch that Augusta had not needed him to believe her. She had only needed him to pause. The pause was the ruin. The pause was already flying from mouth to mouth. He had stood in a silence like this once before and let it be done to him. Now he stood at the giving end of one and felt himself, God help him, wavering. His eyes found Idony across the room. She had heard. Of course she had heard. Augusta had pitched it to be heard, and the crowd had opened a lane between them as though for a duel. so that there was nothing between the Duke and the grey girl but polished floor and 40 avid faces. Idoine stood very straight. The dowager had abandoned her. She held her sister's fan in both hands, and her face had gone the colour of the paper Cassandra had once written him on. But she did not weep, and she did not run, and she did not look to him to save her. She looked at him. And Edric, who prided himself on reading a room, read in that look no plea and no calculation and no fear for herself at all, only a kind of grave sorrow, as though it were he who had been struck, and she who grieved for him. "Well, your grace," Augusta murmured beside him, sweet as syrup over a knife, "will you not defend yourself? Or her? Come, the room is waiting. Say the word and it is finished. Only a word." And there it was, laid out plain. The word that would end it. The single clean sentence that would set him back safe behind his wall and hand this grey inconvenient girl to the wolves and let him leave, as he always left, before the candles guttered. He knew the shape of the sentence. He need only say he had been imposed upon, that he had suspected as much, that Lady Augusta had done him a service, and the whole room would exhale in relief and forgive him everything and remember Idoine Pembroke, if it remembered her at all, as a schemer justly served. He felt the sentence rise to his teeth. It would cost him nothing. It would cost him only her. He looked at Idoine and the sentence died. But he did not, in that terrible moment, cross the floor. This is the thing he would not forgive himself after, that even with the sentence dead in his mouth, even knowing in some deep and honest chamber of himself that Augusta lied, that Idoine had never in her life boasted of anything, that the girl who had told him in a dark garden of her mother's debts and her own small economies without one grain of self-pity was not a girl who kept letters like coin. Even knowing all of it, the old wound held him where he stood. The habit of the wall held him. 12 years of teaching his heart to expect the worst held him fast at the very instant it should have set him free, and the pause stretched and stretched one heartbeat and another, while the whole room watched the Duke of Penshaw fail to defend the woman he loved. It was Idoine who moved first. She crossed the lane the crowd had made, not toward him but toward Augusta, and the room drew a single breath. She stopped a pace away, close enough that Edric could see her hands were steady though her lips were not quite, and when she spoke her voice was low and clear and carried, without her seeming to intend it, to every corner of the sudden hush. "You may say what you like of me, Lady Augusta, and much of it the world will believe, for the world would rather a poor girl were wicked than merely unlucky. It is a cheaper story and asks less of everyone. I have no letters of his grace's. I have never boasted of him nor of anyone, having nothing to boast of and having been raised to think boasting a kind of lying. I did walk in a garden 3 nights past, and I will not pretend I did not, for I am not ashamed of an hour of honest conversation. Though I see now I ought to have known what a garden costs a girl in my position." She paused, and Edric saw her gather herself the way a woman gathers a shawl against cold. "You have wanted, I think, to make me small. You need not have taken such trouble. I have always been small in every room I have entered. It is only that tonight you have made everyone look, and looking is the one kindness this company has never once done me. So I thank you for that, and I will trouble you no further." She turned. She did not look at Edric. That was the cruelty of it, that she spared him even the accusation of a glance, and she began to walk toward the doors, through the parted crowd, past the fans and the bent heads and the sisters who did not move to follow her, her back straight and her chin level and her whole slight figure holding a dignity the whole gilded room could not muster among the lot of them, and Edric stood rooted and let her go. He was a man who had commanded regiments in his youth and had faced, without flinching, things that would have unmanned half this simpering company. He had ridden down on cannon and never lost the reins. And here, on a waxed floor, among people who could hurt no one but with words, he could not command his own 2 feet to carry him 10 paces to a woman's side. The shame of it was as a physical thing, a coldness spreading outward from the breastbone, and still the wall held him, the wall he had built stone by stone against exactly this, against being seen to want, being seen to reach, being seen once more to be the fool who reaches. Cassandra had taught him what it looked like when a man reached and closed his hand on nothing. He had sworn he would never again let a ballroom watch him do it. And so he did the one thing that could not be forgiven, which was nothing at all, and the woman who had never asked him for a single thing walked out of the light and out of his safekeeping, and into whatever the world would now make of her. He would ask himself for the rest of his life how he had let those seconds pass. He would tell himself he had been struck dumb, that the old ghost had had him by the throat, that no man reasons well with a 12-year wound howling in his ears. None of it would answer. The plain fact, the fact he would carry, was that she had walked the length of room alone, defending herself because he would not, and he had let her reach the doors before the paralysis broke. When it broke all at once, and he heard himself say her name, not loudly, but Augusta was close and heard it, and her syrup smile faltered for the first time that evening, and he took one step after the grey figure at the door. Miss Pembroke. She did not stop. Perhaps she did not hear. The room had begun its roar again, the delicious human roar of a scandal fed. Perhaps she heard and had had enough of dukes for one lifetime. The footman opened the door for her, and she passed through it into the cold and the lamplight and was gone, and the door closed, and the roar swelled to fill the place where she had been. Augusta recovered herself with a small laugh. "There, you see," she said low, for him alone, laying 2 fingers again upon his sleeve. "You are well out of it. In a month no one will recall her name. Come, your grace, there is supper, and I have kept you a place." Edric looked down at the fingers on his sleeve, and then at the woman who owned them, and something moved in his face that made her take her hand away of her own accord. "You have made a mistake tonight, Lady Augusta," he said, very quietly, "and it is not the one you think. But that is my reckoning to give, not now and not here." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The nearest heads had already leaned to catch it. "As for the place you have kept me, keep it. I find I have no appetite for anything in this house." He walked out after Idony into the night, but the square was empty. A single hackney was turning the far corner, its lamp swaying, and he did not know if it was hers and could not have caught it if it were. He stood bareheaded on the Harmsworth steps with the cold coming up off the stones and the noise of the rout muffled behind him, and he understood, with a clarity that was its own punishment, exactly what he had done and exactly what it would cost. He had wavered. He had, before the whole of society and the one heart in it worth the keeping, wavered, and the wavering, not Augusta's lie, was the thing that had let the lie win. The girl who wanted nothing of his rank had walked away with the only thing she had ever possessed, her good name, in tatters at her feet, and the last look she had given him had held no anger, only that grave and dreadful sorrow, as though she had known all along that he would fail her and had forgiven him in advance for it, which was worse than any reproach could have been. Behind him the music started up again. Someone laughed. The season would go on, it always went on. By breakfast the story would be in 20 houses, and by the following ball it would be settled fact, and Idony Pembroke would be a schemer unmasked and himself a great man narrowly saved. And Augusta Lovelace would preside over the telling of it with her small triumphant smile. He could see the whole machinery of it grinding already into motion, and he could see too that it looked from every window of lit and murmuring house entirely like a victory, and that the victory was hers, and the ruin was Idony's, and the fault, whatever the world would say, was his own. Edric stood a long while on the steps in the dark, and did not go back in, and the greys were brought round at last, and he did not know where to tell the coachman to go. The letter trembled in Augusta Lovelace's gloved hand, as though it were a thing alive, and Edric watched the bright room lean toward it. 200 candles, and every flame seemed bend the same way the guests did, drawn to the scent of ruin. At the centre of it stood Idony Pembroke, straight-backed and pale, the sapphire pendant that was not hers glittering where it had been found, so they said, tucked within the folds of her shawl. She did not weep. That was the thing he would remember longest afterward, that she did not weep, though every soul in Lady Marchborough's ballroom had already tried and hanged her in the space of a breath. "Read it aloud, your grace," Augusta said, and she was smiling. "You above all should hear what manner of woman has been let near you. Read the hand she wrote in, when she thought no gentleman of consequence would ever see it." He did not take the paper. He found he could move his hand toward it, for his hand belonged to a man he no longer wished to be. The man of 11 years past, standing in a colder room than this, holding another letter, learning in one instant that the woman he had meant to wed had counted his acres before she had ever counted his heart. Cordelia's hand had been round and pretty and full of endearments, and every endearment had been a figure in a ledger. He had sworn on night never again to be a fool for a soft voice. The oath had made him feared, it had made him alone. And now here it was again, the same knife, and Augusta Lovelace was holding it out to him with a courtesy that made his stomach turn. "You hesitate," Augusta said, gently, as one might speak to an invalid. "I understand. It is a hard thing to be deceived. But better a hard truth tonight than a lifetime chained to a little schemer who crept into your notice by pretending she wanted nothing at all. That was cleverest of her, was it not? The others flattered you, she alone withheld. And you, being weary of flattery, mistook the withholding for virtue." Something in him went very still. It was the stillness he wore in the House of Lords when a man had said one word too many and did not yet know it. For Augusta had described Idane's supposed cunning with such particular relish, such intimate certainty of its design, that he understood all at once she was describing not a plan she had discovered but a plan she had drawn. No one reads a stranger's heart so fluently. One reads only one's own. He looked at Idane then, fully, across the terrible little clearing the crowd had made around her. Her chin was lifted. Her eyes met his and did not beg. In them he saw not the plea of the guilty nor even the panic of the wronged, but something graver and more wounding, a kind of farewell. She was letting him go. She had weighed, in that instant, what it would cost a Duke of Penshaw to stand beside an accused thief before all the world, and she had decided to spare him the choosing. She was releasing him the way one releases a bird one has loved too well to cage. That look undid the oath of 11 years as neatly as a blade parts thread. "Give me the letter," Adric said. Augusta's smile widened in triumph, and she pressed it into his glove. The room exhaled. He unfolded it slowly, and he read, but he did not read as they thought he read. He was not searching the words. He knew before he began that the words would be poison. Poison was easy to manufacture. He was searching the paper. "A tender composition," he said at last, and his voice carried, for he had learned long ago to be heard without seeming to raise it. "I care nothing for the man, only for what the man may make of me. Yes, very tender. Written, I see, upon a fine hot-pressed vellum edged in silver, of the sort that comes but from one warehouse in Bond Street, and costs a guinea the quire." He lifted his eyes. "Tell me, Miss Lovelace, for you are more conversant with fashion than I, is that the paper a woman of Miss Pembroke's means would keep in her writing-box? A woman who, as you have been at such pains all season to remind us, turned her gowns twice and walked to balls her family could not send a carriage to." The smile upon Augusta's face did not fall so much as freeze, upon taking ice. "Any lady might come by a sheet of paper," she said. "Any lady might," he agreed. "But observe." He turned the letter so the candlelight struck it aslant, and he held it high, and he walked. He did not hurry. He never hurried. Into the middle of the clearing where all could see. Observe the corner. Pressed into the grain faint as a breath, a crest. A greyhound corrent above 3 martlets. "I have dined beneath that crest, madam. It hangs above your father's hearth in Grosvenor Street. This is Lovelace paper. Miss Pembroke has confessed her poverty to me with more honesty than you have ever confessed anything. She would sooner have gone with our letter than written one upon a stranger's stolen sheet." He let that settle. But she'd not need to, for she did not write this at all. A murmur ran the length of the room like wind through barley. "You cannot know that," Augusta said, and for the first time the Polish cracked and something shrill showed beneath. "A hand is a hand. A hand is a hand," Edric said, "which is why I took the liberty, some weeks past, of keeping one." He drew from within his coat a second paper, worn soft at the folds from carrying. He had told no one he carried it. He had scarcely admitted it to himself, that on the morning after the night in Lady Marchborough's cold garden, when Idane had written him 3 plain lines declining, with grace and without apology, a gift he had pressed upon her because she would not take a gift she had not earned. He had not burned the note as a sensible man burns such things. He had kept it against his heart like a boy. Now the boy's foolishness turned in his hand to a sword. "Come, all who can read," he said, "and be my jury." And he laid the 2 papers side by side upon the pianoforte's closed lid, beneath the branch of candles, and the guests pressed in, and there was no need for him to argue the case, for the eye argued it. The forged letter climbed and looped and flourished, an actor's notion of a lady's hand, each capital a curtsy. The true note was upright, unhurried, economical, the letters closed and honest. A hand that had never once in its life performed. They were not the same hand. They were not the cousins of the same hand. A child could see it. Lady Marchburn saw it, and her painted mouth fell open. Old Lord Cravenhurst put up his glass and grunted and let it fall, and looked at Augusta Lovelace with the particular contempt an old man keeps for a liar who has wasted his evening. "That is not proof," Augusta said. Her voice had lost the room and knew it. She might have disguised. "The sapphire, then," Adric said, turning. "Let us speak of the sapphire, since the letter has failed you." He did not shout. He had never once in the length of this needed to shout, and that, more than any thunder, was what made the crowd go silent to hear. "Lady Marchburn, whose jewel is it?" "Mine," the hostess faltered. "From my own dressing-room. My maid dressed my hair not 2 hours since, and it lay upon the table. Then your maid will know who entered that room after. Send for her." There was a scramble at the edge of the throng, and it was not the maid who came. It was a slight, frightened girl in the grey stuff gown of a lady's companion, Augusta's own companion, a Miss Nan Ferris, whom Adric had seen these many weeks trailing 3 steps behind her mistress with the flinching look of a creature that has learned where blows come from. She had been weeping. She came forward because a footman had gone to fetch the maid, and she could not, in the end, bear it. He saw the whole struggle finish in her face as she stepped into the light. "I cannot," Nan Ferris whispered, and then, louder, to the room, in the reckless voice of one who has decided to drown rather than keep swimming, "I cannot let it stand. She made me carry it. The pendant, she sent me to Lady Marchburn's dressing-room upon an errand of pins. And she bade me take it, and she put it herself into Miss Pembroke's shawl in the retiring room when Miss Pembroke set the shawl aside to mend a lady's torn flounce. For that is where she was, all the while you have imagined her thieving. She was on her knees with a needle, mending the gown of a girl who had laughed at her at supper. I saw it. I have seen everything this half-year and said nothing, because I am poor and she is not. And God forgive me, I am saying it now." The silence after that was of a different kind. It had weight. Edric felt it press upon Augusta Lovelace like water closing over a stone. He looked at the girl in the grey gown and inclined his head to her. A beau, a true one. The sort a Duke of Penshaw was held to owe none but princes. "You will not be poor much longer, Miss Ferris," he said quietly. "Nor unprotected. You have my word on it, and men will tell you what my word is worth." He saw her flinch disbelieving, and understood that no one in her whole hard life had ever thanked her for anything, and he made a private vow to change that, and then he set it aside. For there was a greater debt in the room, and it had waited long enough. "She is a servant," Augusta said, but the words came out with no force at all, a candle held up against a rising sun. "She is a servant, and she has been paid, and you cannot mean to take the word of a paid girl and a fortune hunter over. I mean to take the word of the only 2 women in this room tonight," Edric said, "who have told the truth at cost to themselves." He turned from her then, wholly, as a man turns from a fire that has gone to ash, and he did not look at her again, and that turning away was a more complete destruction than any word could have been. He had unmade her before the entire assembly, not by raising his hand, but by lowering it, by finding her, at the last, beneath his notice. Behind him he heard the crowd's temper turn as crowds do, swift and merciless. The murmurs he had lately heard aimed at Idoni now, swinging round upon the woman who had aimed them. He heard a lady say Augusta's name, and then a small, cruel laugh, the first of many, and he did not trouble to feel glad of it. She was already gone. He had spent his whole cold life among people who devoured whoever fell, and he knew the sound of a season ending. Augusta Lovelace would not be received anywhere by Michaelmas. He found he did not care. His caring had gone entirely elsewhere, and would not, he understood now, ever be recalled. For Idoni had not moved. She stood where she had stood through all of it, in the little clearing that was no longer a scaffold, and the sapphire had been taken from her shawl, and she was cleared, wholly and publicly cleared, and yet she was not smiling either. She looked at him across the ruined evening with that same grave stillness, and he realized with a lurch that clearing her name had settled nothing between them at all. He had proved her honest. He had not yet said the only thing that mattered. And until he said it, she would go on offering him that quiet farewell, releasing him, sparing him, walking out of Lady Marchborough's house tonight with her honor restored and her heart, he feared, resolved to want nothing from a man so far above her that his very defense of her might be counted only justice, only noblesse, only what a great lord owed the weak. He would not have it. 11 years he had guarded a door against exactly this, and now that the door stood open he found he could not cross the threshold fast enough to suit him. He thought, in the space of a heartbeat, of all the reasons a wiser man would give for silence. That a duke did not declare himself in a hostess's ballroom like a subaltern in his cups, that there were estates and a name 3 centuries old and a seat in the Lords that all counselled prudence, that he had been burned once to the bone and the scar still ached in cold weather. He had lived by those reasons so long that they felt like virtues. Standing there, he saw them plainly for what they were, the walls of a comfortable prison he had built himself and called safety, and inside them he had been slowly turning to stone, and no one had troubled to mourn a stone. Idony Pembroke had walked past his walls without ever seeming to try. She had not scaled them. She had simply looked at him once, honestly, as though the walls were not there, and the stone had begun to warm, and he had hated her a little for it because it frightened him, and he did not hate her now. He would never, he knew with the whole of himself, hate anything again so long as she consented to look at him that way. Miss Pembroke. His voice was not steady. He heard it fail and let it. Will you permit me to say, before these people, what I ought to have the courage to say the first night I saw you, when I was too great a coward and too proud a fool? The room, which had thought itself finished, being astonished, went utterly still. They have asked me all season, he said, and now he spoke to her alone, though every ear strained, at every ball, in every card room, from every mother with a marriageable daughter. They have asked me of your sisters, which of the celebrated Pembroke beauties had caught the Duke's eye. They took it for granted that a man such as I, if he stooped to look toward your family at all, must look toward the ones the world had already crowned, and I let them think it. I let them think it because it was safer to be thought hunting a beauty than to confess the truth, which is this. He drew breath. I never once came for your sisters, not to a single ball. I came every evening, down every cold mile from Penshaw, for the quiet one at the edge of the room who mends other women's gowns and asks nothing and flatters no one, and looked at me, the first time we spoke, as though I were a man and not a title. I came for you, only ever for you. Let them all hear it and let them make of it what they will. I came for you, and for no one else who has ever lived. He saw her lips part. He saw the tears she had refused the accusation arrive at last, now brought not by cruelty but by its opposite, and he thought he had never in his life seen anything he wished so violently to reach. But there was the whole width of the room between them, and the crowd, and the wreckage, and Lady Marchborough beginning to speak, and someone's mother swooning decoratively against a pillar, and Augusta being drawn away by a mortified relation, 100 things rising up between his confession and the woman it was meant for. And Idony, overcome, pressed one hand to her mouth and turned and moved, half blind, toward the tall doors and the dark garden beyond, as though after so much watching she could not bear to be watched in this. Edric did not weigh it. For the first time in the memory of anyone present, the Duke of Penshaw, who moved through the world at the unhurried pace of a man certain the world would wait, when after a woman at something no dignity could disguise as a walk, he went through the parting crowd, past the astonished faces, past the pianoforte with its 2 honest and dishonest papers still lying in the candlelight, out under the lintel and into the sudden cool dark where the garden lamps swam, his heart hammering as it had not hammered since he was a boy. Terrified past all reason that he had won every argument tonight save the only one that signified, and that she might yet, out here where no crowd could hold her, slip free of him for good. The width of the ballroom had never seemed so vast. Edric crossed it as a man crosses a river in flood, aware only that the far shore was a woman in a mended grey gown who had already turned her face toward the doors. The music had faltered when he spoke, now it did not resume. The guests fell back from his path without being asked, the way a crowd parts for something it does not understand but knows it must not obstruct. He did not look at them. He had looked at them all his life, measured himself in their eyes, and found the measure wanting. He looked only at Idunny Pembroke. She had reached the threshold when he caught her, and stopped rather than make him call her name across the room a second time. That was like her. She would spare him the spectacle even now, even when the spectacle was owed to her. He came to within a pace and no closer, for he had learned that much of her, that she was not a thing to be seized. "Do not go," he said. It came out lower than he meant, roughened. "I have said the words. I will say them again, and better, and before every soul in this house, but I would say the first of them to you alone, if you will grant me that. Your Grace." Her chin was steady, but he saw the pulse at her throat, quick as a bird's. "You have said a great deal tonight that cannot be unsaid. For your own sake I would have you consider it before you say more." "I have considered nothing else for a month." He was aware of the ring of faces behind him, of Lady Marchborough's fan gone still against her lips. He let them wait. "You believe I speak from pity, from some late-arriving gallantry, because a lie was told against you and I am the man who knew it false. You think I have rescued you, and that you must now be grateful, and that gratitude is a poor foundation, and you would rather have the cold than build a house upon it. Have I read you right?" Her lips parted. She said nothing, which was answer enough. "Then hear me correct you," Edric said. "I did not come to this ball to defend you. I came because you would be here. I have gone nowhere these 6 weeks that you would not be. I have accepted invitations from people I despise on the wager that your name might be on the same list as mine. That is not rescue, Miss Pembroke. That is not pity. It is a far less dignified thing, and I have been ashamed of it, and I am ashamed no longer." He heard the intake of breath around them, but her eyes did not leave his, and it was to her eyes he spoke. "Come out with me, onto the terrace where there is air. Not because you owe me the hearing, you owe me nothing, but because I have carried this too long, and I find I cannot carry it another hour." For a moment he thought she would refuse. She glanced once, briefly, toward the far wall where her sisters stood, Rosalind and Cecily, the celebrated Pembroke beauties, the 2 names every suitor in the county had asked after, while their eyes slid past the third and plainest sister as though she were a pillar or a servant with a tray. The 2 of them were watching now, wide-eyed, and Edric understood in that glance that Idunny was not seeking their permission. She was making sure they were safe. Even now, ruined in the room's estimation not an hour past, she thought first of them. "Very well," she said. "The terrace." The night was cool and smelled of cut-box hedge and the coming rain. The terrace lay empty, its lanterns guttering low, the dark garden falling away beyond toward the black shapes of the elms. She walked to the stone rail and set both hands upon it and looked out, and he came to stand beside her, close but not touching, the way they had stood in the library a fortnight since when he had first understood he was lost. "You wish to know why I am as I am," he said. "Why a man called the most eligible in 3 counties should be reckoned cold, and stand at the edge of every ballroom like a sentry who has forgotten what he guards. I have never told it whole to anyone living. I will tell it to you, because you have never once asked. You need not. I need to." He turned the ring on his smallest finger, an old habit, the signet worn thin at the shoulders. 11 years ago I was to be married. Her name does not matter. You would not know it. She is abroad and content. I was 27 and I believed myself beloved. I was not a duke then, my brother lived, and I was a younger son with a soldier's commission and no prospect but what my own arm might win me. She was warm to me. She laughed at what I said. And then my brother died of a fever at Michaelmas, and I became what I am, and within the month she was warmer still, and within the season she wept when I did not name the wedding day soon enough. I was fool enough to think the change in her was grief for my brother's sake. It was not. I overheard her, Miss Pembroke. I will spare you the words, but I overheard her tell her mother that she had feared she was throwing herself away upon a captain, and how providential it was, how very providential that the elder should die. Idunny had gone very still. "So I released her," Edric said, "kindly. I told no one, and I resolved never again to mistake the coronet for the man beneath it. I learned to watch for the moment the warmth arrives. It comes always at the same instant, when a woman recollects the title, and to close the door before it. I closed a great many doors, so long that I forgot the house had rooms in it at all." He looked at her. "And then I stood in a doorway 6 weeks ago and heard a young woman tell a marquis that no, she would not flatter his hunting. For she had seen him ride, and he sat a horse like a sack of turnips, and she said it without malice and without the smallest glance at his rank, and the Marquess laughed because it was true, and I did not laugh, because I had just felt the door I had bolted for 11 years come off its hinges. A sound escaped her, half a laugh, half something else. You heard that. I have heard everything you have said in a public room for 6 weeks. I could not stop myself. He drew a breath. You never warmed to me, Idoni. That is the whole of it. Every other soul in these rooms alters when I approach. The voice climbs, the eyes soften, the hand comes up to the throat. You have looked at me from the first as though I were a man who might be interesting or might be tiresome, and the matter was not yet decided. You told me I was wrong about the enclosure bill, and you were right, and you did not apologize for it. You have never once let me pay for the pleasure of your good opinion, because it was not for sale, and I have been half mad with wanting the one thing in England I could not purchase. The wind moved in the elms. Somewhere below, the first fat drops of rain began to strike the leaves. You speak, she said slowly, as though wanting a thing were the same as deserving it. It is not. I know it is not. He turned fully toward her. I wavered tonight, and you saw me waver. When Miss Lovelace stood up with her letter and her witnesses, I felt the old fear rise, and for the space of 3 heartbeats I doubted you. I will not pretend it did not happen. You would know the lie, and I am done with closing doors on you. I doubted you, and I have never been more ashamed of anything in my life. But on the 4th heartbeat I knew, with a certainty I have felt about nothing else, that the world was more likely false than that you were. And so I spoke. You destroyed her, Idoni said quietly. Augusta. You produced her own maid and the pawnbroker's book, and you laid it all out before the room like a barrister. You did not have to do it so thoroughly. I did. His jaw set. She meant to see you ruined past any mending, put out of every door, made to depend upon the charity of the sisters she has spent a season teaching this county to prize above you. She wagered on your dignity to hang you. A woman who steals from her hostess, she said, would be too meek to protest. I destroyed her because half measures leave a serpent living, and I would not have you spend your life waiting for the second bite. He paused. But I did not do it to win you, and I want that understood before another word. Miss Lovelace would have been unmasked tonight whether you'd ever spoken to me or not, because what she did was vile, and I had the proof of it in my hand. Your ruin and my wanting are 2 separate matters. I will not have you thanking me for the one and calling it the other. That reached her. He watched it reach her, watched the careful composure she wore like armor loosen at the seams, watched her eyes shine and her hand tighten on the wet stone. That, she said, and her voice was not steady now, is the only thing you could have said that I would believe. Then believe it. Edric. It was the first time she had used his name, and the sound of it in her mouth undid something in his chest that had been knotted for 11 years. I am the daughter of a country parson with 300 a year and no son. I have no fortune and no beauty any man has troubled to see while my sisters stood in the same room. I have a decent hand, a plain face, and a tongue that has cost me every connection my mother ever schemed at. I do not say it to be pitied. You of all men know I do not pity myself. I say it because you must be clear-eyed. If you take my hand tonight, before that room you take all of it, and there is no fortune to gild it. The county will say the Duke of Penshaw ran mad and married the Pembroke girl no one else would have. The county, Edric said, may say what it likes. It has said a great many things about me and been wrong in every one. He held out his hand, palm up, between them in the falling rain, and did not close the distance himself. I am not asking you to be rescued, Idoni. I am asking you to rescue nothing, to owe nothing, to be grateful for nothing. I am asking whether you could, in time, want the man, not the title, not the house, not the 8,000 a year, all of which I would give up tomorrow and count it cheap, but the man who cannot sleep for thinking of your voice, and who has been more himself in 6 weeks of your company than in 11 years of everyone else's. That is all I have to offer that is worth the offering. It is not much, it is only everything I am. The rain came harder. Neither of them moved to shelter. She looked at his open hand for a long moment, and then she looked at his face, and what he saw come into her eyes was not gratitude. He would have hated gratitude, but something clearer and steadier and far more terrifying. The look of a woman deciding to want a thing she had trained herself for years never to want. I have been afraid, she said, that if I let myself, I would not be able to stop. Then do not stop. She put her hand in his. It was cold from the stone and wet from the rain, and it fit into his as though the bone of him had been carved to receive it, and Edric closed his fingers around it and bowed his head and stood so, breathing, while the whole long, guarded architecture of his life quietly came down and left him in the open with nothing between himself and the sky. He did not kiss her. He raised her hand and pressed it to the line of his jaw and held it there, and felt her fingers curl against his skin, and that was more than any kiss he had ever taken. "Come inside," he said at last, hoarse. "There is one thing more I must do, and I will not do it where they cannot see." "Edric, they passed you over," he said. "Every man in that room for 2 seasons asked me about your sisters. They stood at your elbow and inquired after Rosalind's eyes and Cecily's dowry, and never once saw the finest heart in 3 counties. I will not have that be the last word the world says of you." She came. He led her back through the tall doors, and the rain dark gave way to the blaze of the candles, and the whole room turned as one. Augusta Lovelace was gone, bundled out by her mortified mother, while the truth still hung in the air, and in her place was a silence so complete he could hear the wax hiss in the sconces. Lady Marchborough's musicians stood frozen with their bows half lifted. The Pembroke sisters clutched one another near the hearth, and there, at the centre of the floor, Edric stopped, with Idane's cold hand held fast in his, and he did not lower his voice. "I am aware," he said, to the room, "that many of you have wondered these 2 seasons why the Duke of Penshaw comes to balls he despises and dances with no one and leaves early. I will end your wondering. Every one of you who approached me approached with the same question upon your lips, whether I might be introduced to the elder Miss Pembroke or the younger, whether Rosalind was spoken for, whether Cecily would be at Ashcombe in the spring. And every one of you, in asking it, walked past the woman whose hand I now hold as though she were furniture." He felt her fingers tighten in his in warning and wonder, and he did not stop. "You asked me about her sisters. Hear me plainly, so that no soul in this county mistakes it hereafter. I never came for them. I came for her. I came only ever for her. And if she will have me, which is more than I deserve and the whole of what I want, then it is Idane Pembroke who will be Duchess of Penshaw, and every one of you who could not trouble to learn her name will spend the rest of your lives learning it." The silence held 1 heartbeat longer. Then Rosalind Pembroke, the elder, the beauty, the one whose eyes had launched the season's poetry, began to weep openly and to clap, and Cecily beside her, and it broke over the room like a wave, the applause, ragged and astonished, and then full-throated, and Edric heard none of it, because Idane had turned her face up to him, with the rain still bright in her lashes, and was laughing and crying at once and shaking her head at him as though he were the most impossible man in England, which, he thought, he very likely was. "You could not have done it quietly," she said. "No," he agreed. "I found I could not." They were married at the parish church her father served in the autumn, the leaves down gold along the churchyard wall, and the whole county crammed into pews built for a village. He would have had the cathedral, but she wished it there, among the people who had known her when she was nobody, and he had discovered that her wishes had become the shape his own took. Her sisters attended her, both of them, and it was long remarked that the celebrated Pembroke beauties stood a half-pace behind the plain one now, and were glad to. He never grew easy in crowds, that much of him did not change. But it was observed that the Duke of Penshaw no longer stood sentry at the edge of a room. He stood wherever his Duchess stood, a little behind her shoulder, and when she spoke he watched the faces of those she addressed as though daring them not to see what he saw. They saw it. In time the whole county saw it, and forgot they had ever looked past her, and swore they had always known. On a night that first winter, long after the last candle in the great house had been carried up, Edric found her in the library where he had first been undone, curled in the window seat with a book and a shawl and the frost feathering the black glass. He sat, and she leaned into him without looking up from her page, and he put his arm about her and rested his chin against her hair and felt the whole warm weight of her settle against his side like something coming home. "You are staring," she murmured. "You are always staring." "I mean to go on doing it," he said. 11 years I looked at everyone and saw no one. I have a great deal of looking to make up. He drew the shawl closer about her shoulder, and she turned her hand up on his knee without being asked, and he laced his fingers into hers. There in the quiet, with the fire low and the frost on the glass and the whole overlooked world outside gone to sleep, the once guarded Duke held the woman that world had failed to see, and knew, past every doubt that had ever ruled him, that he had chosen the only riches worth the name.